Did you know the average life expectancy in medieval Europe was about 35 years? For a person living in the 12th century, a simple cut could be a death sentence. A failed crop meant starvation. Getting lost in the woods was not a fun camping trip. It was a fight for your life. They didn't have GPS, supermarkets, or emergency rooms. They had their hands, their wits, and a collection of skills passed down through generations. These weren't hobbies. They were the daily toolkit for staying alive. We live in a world of incredible convenience. We can order food with a tap, navigate a city with a voice command, and access the sum of human knowledge from a device in our pocket. But what if that world disappeared tomorrow? What if the power grid failed, the supply chains broke, and the internet went dark? Would you know how to find clean water? Could you build a shelter to survive the night? Do you know which plants in your backyard are food and which are poison? The people of the Middle Ages knew these things. They had to. Their survival depended on a deep practical understanding of the natural world. They were the original preppers, not by choice, but by necessity. Learning their skills isn't about romanticizing a brutal past. It's about reconnecting with a fundamental human inheritance of self-reliance. It's about understanding the simple, powerful knowledge that kept our ancestors alive through famine, plague, and war. What did they know that we've forgotten? And in a world that feels increasingly fragile, could that forgotten knowledge be the key to our own survival? Number 18, can a hammer and fire still forge a future? The blacksmith was the heart of the medieval village. He was the local engineer, the toolmaker, the armorer, and the repairman all rolled into one. His forge was a place of elemental power where earth and fire were commanded to create the essentials of civilization. Without the blacksmith, there were no nails to build a house, no plowshare to till the fields, no axe to chop wood, no sword to defend the realm. Skills were not just a trade, they were the bedrock of the entire economy and military. When a knight needed his armor mended or a farmer needed a new hoe, they went to the smith. His knowledge of metallurgy was a form of magic to the common person, a closely guarded set of secrets passed from master to apprentice. The sound of his hammer on the anvil was the pulse of medieval life. The history of blacksmithing is ancient, but it was perfected during the Middle Ages. The development of better bellows, water-powered trip hammers in the High Middle Ages, and an improved understanding of charcoal and heat allowed for the creation of stronger, more durable steel. Consider the legendary swords of the era, like the Ulfbert swords made by Vikings around the 9th to 11th centuries. These blades were made of crucible steel, a material so pure and strong that European smiths would not be able to replicate its quality for hundreds of years. The secrets of their forging process are still debated by archaeologists and metallurgists today. They show a level of mastery that was far beyond simple trial and error. Finds at archaeological sites like La Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, a Norse settlement from around 1000 AD, reveal remnants of a smithy showing that this essential skill was one of the first things Vikings established in a new land. It was as vital as finding food and water. So, how did they do it? The basic process is one of controlled violence. You start with a forge, a hearth designed to get incredibly hot, fed by charcoal and forced air from a bellows. You heat a piece of iron until it glows cherry red or even orange yellow. At this temperature, the metal becomes plastic, like clay. You then move it to an anvil, a massive block of iron, and strike it with a hammer. Every strike shapes the metal. You can draw it out, making it longer and thinner. You can upset it, making it shorter and thicker. You can bend it, punch holes in it, or forge weld two pieces together by heating them to a near molten state and hammering them until they fuse. The final step is often quenching, plunging the hot metal into water or oil. This rapid cooling hardens the steel, but also makes it brittle. So, a final process called tempering, or gentle reheating, is needed to restore some toughness. It's a delicate dance of heat, force, and timing. In a modern survival context, these skills are transformative. Knowing how to work metal means you are no longer just a user of tools, you are a creator of them. You can find a piece of scrap metal from a broken down car, an old leaf spring, and turn it into a knife, an axe head, or a set of fishing hooks. You can repair a broken garden tool instead of throwing it away. You don't need a fancy forge. A hole in the ground, some charcoal, and a simple bellows made from leather and wood can work. Your anvil can be a large, flat, hard rock. It's about understanding the principles, not owning the expensive equipment. This knowledge elevates you from a scavenger in a crisis to a builder and a provider. It's the difference between finding a can of food and being able to create the tool that opens any can you find. Despite our advanced understanding of material science, the precise techniques of ancient mastersmiths, like those who made the Ulfbert swords, remain partly a mystery. We analyze the steel and see the results, but we can't perfectly replicate the process with their tools. How do they achieve such consistent high quality without thermometers or modern chemical analysis? What subtle signs in the color of the flame or the feel of the hammer did they understand intuitively? And in a world without electricity, could we relearn the art of creating high carbon steel from raw iron ore, or is that knowledge now permanently lost to all but a few dedicated historians and craftspeople? Number 17, can you feed a family from a patch of dirt? For over 90% of the population in the Middle Ages, life was tied to the soil. There were no supermarkets, no global supply chains. You ate what you grew, or you starved. The concept of a lawn was an absurd luxury. Every patch of usable land was for production. The medieval peasant's life revolved around the agricultural calendar, plowing in the spring, tending crops in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and surviving the winter on what was stored. Their understanding of the land wasn't academic, it was intimate and essential. They knew the feel of their soil, the way it held water, and what it would grow. This knowledge was the difference between a full belly and the devastating famines that periodically swept across Europe, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions and demonstrated the terrifying fragility of the food supply. Medieval agriculture was more sophisticated than we often imagine. They developed the three-field system of crop rotation, a major innovation over the Roman two-field system. One field would be planted with a grain like wheat or rye in the autumn. A second would be planted in the spring with legumes like peas, beans, or lentils. The third field was left fallow, unplanted, to recover its fertility. The legumes were a brilliant addition because they are nitrogen fixers, meaning they naturally replenish the soil with essential nutrients that the grains deplete. This system increased food production by a third and provided a more varied diet. Beyond the large communal fields, almost every cottage had a small private garden called a hortus, where they grew vegetables like onions, leeks, and cabbage, along with herbs for cooking and medicine. These kitchen gardens were the domain of the women and were crucial for supplementing the family's diet. The Plan of St. Gall, a famous architectural drawing from around 820 AD, shows a detailed layout for an ideal monastery, including a dedicated vegetable garden, a physic medicinal garden, and orchards, demonstrating the high level of planning and knowledge that went into medieval food production. The practical skill here is subsistence gardening. It's about growing calorie-dense, nutrient-rich, and easily storable crops. Think potatoes, beans, squash, and hardy greens like kale. The first step is understanding your soil. Is it sandy, loamy, or clay? You can improve any soil with compost, which is simply decayed organic matter. Medieval farmers knew this well, using animal manure and household scraps to enrich their fields. Next is planning your garden to maximize space and yield, a practice known as intensive gardening. You don't need a huge plot of land. A well-managed small garden can produce a surprising amount of food. Learning to save seeds from your own plants is also a critical skill. It frees you from depending on buying new seeds every year and allows you to select seeds from your strongest, most productive plants, gradually adapting your crops to your specific local conditions over generations. This is exactly how our ancestors developed the thousands of heirloom vegetable varieties we have today. In a world where the average food item travels 1,500 miles before it reaches our plate, the ability to grow your own food is a radical act of self-sufficiency. It provides food security in a crisis, better nutrition, and a powerful connection to the natural cycles of the seasons. Starting a small garden is one of the most practical survival skills you can learn. It teaches you about planning, patience, and the profound satisfaction of eating something you grew with your own hands. It's a skill that feeds you not just physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. It's a direct link to the way nearly all our ancestors lived for millennia. We know about the three-field system and the crops they grew, but what about the fine details? How did they effectively combat pests and diseases without modern chemicals? They used companion planting and natural predators, but the specific local techniques are largely lost. Were ancient, pre-hybridized crop varieties more resilient to drought and disease than our modern high-yield monocultures? And if our global industrialized agricultural system were to collapse, how many people today actually possess the knowledge to save their own seeds and cultivate a piece of land well enough to survive. Number 16, does a good story outlast a sword? In a world without electricity, television, or the internet, how did people spend their evenings? After a long day of hard labor, when darkness made work impossible, they gathered around the fire. And they told stories. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a vital survival mechanism. It was the way culture, history, values, and practical knowledge were passed from one generation to the next. In an era where most people were illiterate, memory was the most important library. A good storyteller, a bard or a scop, was a respected and essential member of the community. They were the keepers of the tribe's identity. They sang epic poems like Beowulf, telling tales of heroes and monsters, of courage and folly. These stories reinforced social bonds, taught moral lessons, and gave people a sense of shared purpose in history. The power of narrative is deeply embedded in the human psyche. Modern psychological research, such as the work by Jerome Bruner, suggests that our brains are wired to understand the world through stories. A list of rules is forgettable, but a story about a character who breaks those rules and suffers the consequences is memorable. This was crucial in the Middle Ages. A story about a traveler who ignored the old warnings and was led astray by fairies in a dark wood was a more effective way of teaching children to stay on the path than a simple command. A tale about a clever farmer who outwitted a greedy lord could provide a much-needed emotional release and a sense of hope in a rigid feudal society. Storytelling was also a way to process trauma and fear. In a world filled with disease, war, and inexplicable events, stories gave chaos a shape and a meaning. They were a way to make sense of the senseless. The practical skill is not just telling stories, but listening and remembering. It's about building a mental archive of useful information. In a survival situation, morale is as important as food and water. A person who can calm fears, build hope, and unite a group with a shared story is an invaluable leader. Think about it in a modern context. If a group of people is stranded after a disaster, panic and despair are the greatest enemies. Someone who can take charge, not through force, but by creating a narrative of survival, by reminding people of their strengths, by telling stories of others who have overcome similar challenges, can be the difference between life and death. This person can weave together individual efforts into a collective goal. They can distract from misery and focus the group's energy on positive action. This skill is also about preserving information without writing it down. Can you remember a set of complex instructions after hearing them only once? Can you pass that information on to someone else without errors? Medieval people had to. Bards could recite epic poems that were thousands of lines long. This required powerful memory techniques such as the use of rhythm, rhyme, and vivid imagery, which are still studied today. Learning to tell a story well, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and with compelling details, is to learn how to communicate effectively. It's about capturing attention, conveying information, and making a lasting impact. In any crisis, clear communication and strong morale are critical. The medieval storyteller knew this better than anyone. We have the texts of great epics, like Beowulf and the Norse sagas, but how much was lost? What percentage of the oral traditions of the common folk, the unwritten stories and songs of the village, vanished without a trace? Could these lost stories have contained practical survival knowledge, local histories, or unique worldviews that are now gone forever? And in our modern world, saturated with digital media, are we losing our own capacity for deep listening and long-term memory, the very skills that allowed our ancestors' cultures to survive? Number 15, what can you do when your only weapon is a stick? The medieval world was a violent place. War was common, banditry was a constant threat, and the rule of law could be arbitrary and distant. For the nobility, defense meant swords, armor, and castles. But for the common peasant, who was forbidden by law in many places from owning a sword, self-defense was a different matter. They had to rely on what was at hand: farm implements, simple tools, and the most basic and versatile weapon of all, the staff. The quarterstaff, a stout pole of hardwood, usually 6 to 9 feet long, was the great equalizer. It was cheap, easy to make, and in the hands of a skilled user, it was a formidable weapon capable of blocking, striking, and tripping an opponent, even one with a sword. Historical European martial arts were not just for knights. Fighting manuals from the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, such as those by Hans Talhofer, include detailed instructions on staff fighting. These were not just crude bludgeoning techniques, they were sophisticated martial systems with specific guards, footwork, and strikes. The staff offered superior reach, allowing a user to keep a bladed opponent at a distance. Its two-handed grip allowed for powerful blows and strong parries. It could be used to thrust like a spear, swing like a club, or hook and trip an opponent's legs. The skills were practical and were likely taught informally within villages for generations. A peasant traveling between villages or a shepherd guarding his flock from wolves and men would have been foolish not to carry a sturdy staff and know how to use it. This wasn't about seeking battle, but about having a credible means of defense to de-escalate a confrontation or survive an attack. The core skill is improvisation and situational awareness. It's about understanding that anything can be a tool for self-defense. A walking stick, an umbrella, a tightly rolled magazine, a sturdy branch from a tree. The principles of using a staff, maintaining distance, using two hands for leverage and power, targeting vulnerable areas can be applied to many common objects. The most important part of medieval self-defense, however, was avoiding the fight in the first place. This meant being aware of your surroundings, recognizing potential threats, and knowing safe routes and times to travel. It was about projecting a quiet confidence that discouraged potential attackers, who are often looking for an easy target. In a modern crisis, the ability to defend yourself and your family is crucial. While a staff may seem archaic, the principles behind its use are timeless. It teaches you about body mechanics, leverage, and the importance of distance. Learning a simple martial art, even a basic self-defense course, gives you confidence and a plan. But more importantly, it hones your awareness. You learn to pay attention to your environment, to spot trouble before it starts. This is the true skill of the medieval peasant, not just the ability to fight with a stick, but the wisdom to know when to walk away, when to hide, and when, as a last resort, to stand your ground with whatever tool you have at hand. It's about having a plan for the worst-case scenario so you don't freeze when it happens. The historical fighting manuals that survive were mostly written by and for the upper classes. How different were the actual fighting styles of the common peasant? What dirty, brutally effective techniques, never recorded in formal texts, were passed down from father to son? Did they have their own sophisticated systems that have been completely lost to history? And how effective, really, was a skilled staff wielder against a trained swordsman in a real-life encounter away from the controlled environment of the training hall? Number 14. Can the sky tell you more than a weather app? For a medieval farmer, sailor, or soldier, predicting the weather was a matter of life and death. A sudden frost could ruin a crop. An unexpected storm could sink a ship. A heavy rain could turn a battlefield into a muddy quagmire, completely changing the course of a battle, as it did at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where the muddy ground heavily favored the English longbowmen against the heavily armored French knights. They had no satellites, no radar, no meteorologists. They had something more immediate, a deep sensory connection to the world around them. They read the weather by observing the sky, the behavior of animals, and the reactions of plants. This was a science born of thousands of hours of patient observation passed down through folklore and proverbs. Many of the sayings we still know today have their roots in this observational science. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in morning, sailor's warning. This isn't just an old wives' tale. A red sunset is often caused by dust particles and dry air to the west, where weather systems typically come from, suggesting stable, high-pressure conditions are on the way. A red sunrise, however, indicates that this dry air has already passed, and a low-pressure system with moisture is likely following it. They knew that a ring around the moon, a halo, often predicted rain or snow, because the ring is created by ice crystals and high-altitude cirrus clouds, which are often the first sign of an approaching storm front. They watched the behavior of animals. Cows lying down in a field were thought to predict rain, perhaps because they sense a drop in atmospheric pressure. Birds flying low could also signal an impending storm, as the changing air pressure can make it more difficult for them to fly at high altitudes. The fundamental skill is learning to be observant. It's about stepping outside and paying attention. What direction is the wind coming from? What kinds of clouds are in the sky? Are they the high, wispy, cirrus clouds that signal fair weather, or the low, dark, and heavy nimbostratus clouds that bring steady rain? Are they the towering cumulonimbus clouds that build on a hot afternoon and warn of a thunderstorm? You can feel the change in humidity on your skin. You can smell the rain in the air before it falls, a scent called petrichor caused by oils released from plants and bacteria in the soil. It's about using all your senses to gather data from your immediate environment. This skill is still incredibly valuable. Weather apps are great, but they give you a generalized forecast for a large area. They can be wrong and they won't tell you about the specific microclimate in your valley or on your hill. In a survival situation, or even just on a long hike, being able to read the signs of an approaching storm can give you the crucial time you need to find shelter. It reconnects you to the natural world in a profound way. It forces you to look up from your screen and see the intricate and beautiful systems at play in the atmosphere above you. It is a language that nature is always speaking. We have just forgotten how to listen. We can scientifically explain many of the old weather proverbs, but how many did we lose? What subtle animal behaviors or plant reactions did medieval people understand that we now dismiss as folklore? Is it possible that certain animals have sensory abilities to detect weather changes, like shifts in barometric pressure or electromagnetism, that our instruments cannot? And if we were stripped of our technology, how long would it take us to relearn this deep observational science of the sky and the land? Would we be able to do it before it was too late? Number 13, could you fix your own clothes to survive? In the Middle Ages, textiles were incredibly valuable. A new tunic or cloak was a major investment, far beyond the means of the average person to replace casually. The process of making cloth was long and laborious, from raising the sheep or growing the flax, to shearing, spinning the fiber into thread, weaving the thread into cloth on a loom, and finally cutting and sewing the garment by hand. Because of this, clothing was worn until it literally fell apart. Mending was not just a chore, it was an essential economic activity. A simple tear was not a reason to discard a garment, it was an opportunity to repair it, to extend its life. Patches were common, and a multi-patched garment was a sign not of poverty, but of thrift. Knowing how to sew was a basic life skill for everyone, not just women. Soldiers had to be able to repair their own gear, and sailors their sails. The tools were simple but effective. Needles were made from bone, bronze, or iron, and were precious possessions. Thread was spun from wool, linen, or nettle fibers. A basic running stitch could close a seam, while a darning technique could reweave the threads over a hole, creating a durable patch that was integral to the fabric itself. The archaeological finds from medieval sites all over Europe include thimbles, pins, and needles, showing how widespread these tools were. The Bayeux Tapestry, a massive embroidered cloth depicting the Norman conquest of England in 1066, is a testament to the incredible skill of medieval needleworkers. While a grand artistic achievement, it was created using the same basic stitches that a peasant woman would have used to mend her family's clothes. The skill was scalable, from a simple patch on a pair of trousers to a work of art that has lasted for nearly 1,000 years. The practical skill is basic mending. You don't need a sewing machine. All you need is a needle, some thread, and a little knowledge. Learning to sew on a button is a start. Learning a simple, strong stitch like the back stitch can allow you to repair a split seam on a backpack or a pair of pants. Learning how to apply a patch can save a favorite pair of jeans or a trusty work jacket. This is the skill of maintenance and repair. It's a mindset that runs counter to our modern throwaway culture. It's about seeing value in the things we own and having the ability to care for them. In a long-term survival scenario, this is not a trivial skill. Your clothing is your first line of defense against the elements. Like a tear in your jacket in a cold, wet environment can lead to heat loss and hypothermia. Being able to perform a quick, durable repair on your clothing or gear could be a life-saving intervention. This skill extends beyond just clothing. The ability to stitch things together is fundamental. You can repair a torn tent, a ripped tarp, or a damaged blanket. You can even use a large needle and strong cord to stitch up a deep wound in an emergency when proper medical care is unavailable. It is a foundational skill of making and mending, of holding things together. It teaches patience and attention to detail. It is a small act of self-reliance that empowers you to be a producer and a caretaker, not just a consumer. We know the basic techniques they used, but what about the tricks of the trade? What were the specialized knots or stitches used by sailors to repair a storm-torn sail with frozen fingers? What were the secrets of the professional embroiderers who created the incredibly detailed tapestries for castles and churches? How did they prepare their threads to make them stronger or more resistant to rot using plant-based waxes or other substances we've forgotten? And in a world of fast fashion, are we losing the very concept of clothing as a durable, repairable good? Number 12, why was making soap a matter of life and death? We think of the Middle Ages as a filthy time, and in many ways it was. Cities were crowded, sanitation was poor, and the germ theory of disease was centuries away. However, people did value cleanliness, and they did have soap. Soap making was a common household and commercial activity. It wasn't the perfumed, perfectly formed bars we have today, but a soft, lye-based soap that was highly effective. The importance of soap went beyond simple hygiene. It was a critical tool in preventing the spread of disease. While they didn't understand the mechanism of germs, they did observe that cleanliness was linked to health. Guilds of soap makers, or saponari, existed in cities across Europe, and soap was a significant trade item, especially high-quality olive oil-based soaps from Spain and Italy, like the famous Aleppo soap from the Levant. The chemistry of soap making is a medieval technology that hasn't changed in its fundamentals. It involves a process called saponification, which is a chemical reaction between a fat or oil and a strong alkali. The two key ingredients were readily available. The fat came from butchered animals, tallow from beef or lard from pork, or from plants like olive oil. The alkali, known as lye, was derived from wood ash. Water was trickled through a barrel of hardwood ashes, and the liquid that leached out was a solution of potassium hydroxide, a caustic substance. This lye water was then boiled with the fat for hours. The mixture had to be stirred constantly. It was a smelly, dangerous process. Lye is highly corrosive and can cause severe burns. As the mixture cooked, it would slowly thicken. The soap maker would test it by taking a small amount out to cool. When it was ready, it was poured into a mold to harden. The resulting soap was functional, not luxurious. It was often harsh on the skin, but it got you clean. Knowing how to make soap is a game-changing survival skill. In any situation where sanitation is compromised, from a natural disaster to a long-term societal collapse, the ability to wash your hands, your clothes, and your cooking utensils can prevent the spread of deadly diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. The lack of basic hygiene was a major contributor to the devastating mortality rate of the Black Death, which killed up to half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. While soap alone wouldn't have stopped the plague, which was spread by fleas, the general lack of sanitation created the conditions for disease to thrive. In a world without antibiotics, prevention is the only cure, and soap is the single most effective tool for prevention. The process can be replicated with basic materials. You can make lye from the ashes of a hardwood fire. You can render fat from animals you've hunted or raised. It requires knowledge and caution, but it is a technology that is entirely off-grid. It represents a fundamental step up in long-term survivability. It's the ability to create order and health in a world that is descending into chaos. Having a supply of soap in a crisis is having a supply of medicine. It allows you to maintain a standard of hygiene that protects you and your group from the invisible enemies that have killed more humans throughout history than all the wars combined, bacteria and viruses. Medieval soap makers operated by feel and experience, not by precise chemical formulas. How did they manage to create consistent products without understanding the chemistry of saponification? What were their methods for testing the strength of the lye solution, a critical and dangerous step? Were there regional variations in soap making, using local plants or fats that produce soaps with unique properties we are unaware of? And what other basic chemical processes vital for survival did they master through pure trial and error? And number 11, can you turn an animal's skin into your own? For medieval people, leather was the equivalent of our modern high-performance plastics. It was strong, durable, flexible, and relatively waterproof. It was used for everything: shoes, belts, armor, saddles, harnesses, buckets, bottles, book bindings, and hinges for doors. Without leather, the medieval economy and military would have ground to a halt. The tanner was one of the most essential and also one of the most ostracized craftsmen in any town. The process of turning a raw, rotting animal hide into stable, usable leather was a smelly, disgusting, and chemically complex business. Tan yards were always located on the edge of town, usually downstream, for good reason. But the transformation they worked was almost magical, taking a product of death and decay and turning it into a material that could last for generations. The process of tanning, in its most basic form, has been known for thousands of years. Otzi, the Iceman, whose 5,300-year-old body was found in the Alps, was clad in expertly crafted gear made from the leather of at least 5 different animals. The medieval tanner perfected these ancient techniques. First, the raw hide had to be cleaned of all flesh and fat. Then it was soaked in a solution to loosen the hair, often a foul mixture of lime or even stale urine. The hair was then scraped off with a dull blade. This prepared hide, now called a pelt, was then ready for tanning. The most common method in Europe was vegetable tanning. The pelts were soaked for months, sometimes even years, in large pits filled with water and tannin-rich materials, usually the bark of oak trees. Tannin is a chemical that binds to the collagen proteins in the hide, displacing the water and preventing the proteins from putrefying. It makes the hide stable and resistant to decay. After the long soak, the leather was slowly dried, stretched, and treated with fats and oils to make it supple. The survival skill here is the ability to preserve a valuable resource. If you hunt an animal for food, its hide is a massive bonus, but only if you know what to do with it. Without processing, it will quickly rot and become useless. Learning a basic, primitive tanning method allows you to create durable material for a huge range of needs. You can make simple shoes, moccasins, a protective cloak, a bag to carry supplies, or cordage and straps for building and hauling. A simplified version, often called brain tanning, is an ancient method that uses the animal's own brain. The fats and emulsifiers in the brain tissue are worked into the hide, and then the hide is smoked. This produces a very soft, supple leather known as buckskin. It's an intensive physical process, but it requires no external chemicals, just the animal itself, a scraper tool, and a smoky fire. This knowledge represents a profound level of self-sufficiency. It's about using every part of a resource and wasting nothing. It connects you to a deep history of human ingenuity. The ability to take a raw material from nature and through a complex but understandable process, transform it into something of immense practical value is a cornerstone of survival. It moves you beyond simple day-to-day existence and allows you to create durable goods that improve your quality of life and your long-term chances of success. Tanning was a craft full of trade secrets. What were the specific mixtures of bark that different tanners used to produce leather of varying color, hardness, or flexibility? We know they used oak, but what other plants were used that we've forgotten? How did they tan the hides of fish or birds to create specialized lightweight materials? And is there a way to speed up the incredibly long process of vegetable tanning without modern chemicals? A secret fast tanning method that has been lost to time. Number 10. How do you build a world with just an axe and a saw? A wood was the fuel and the building material of the medieval world. From the peasant's simple cruck frame hut to the soaring timber frames of great cathedrals, wood was everywhere. A person's life was surrounded by it. The wooden chair they sat on, the wooden bowl they ate from, the wooden cart that took their goods to market, and the wooden coffin they were buried in. The carpenter and the woodworker were therefore essential craftsmen. They weren't just building things, they were creating the entire physical infrastructure of their society. They knew the trees of their local forest intimately. They knew which wood was best for which task: oak for strength and durability in a house frame, ash for flexibility in a tool handle, yew for power in a longbow. This was a deep practical knowledge of material science, learned through hands-on experience over countless generations. The tools they used were simple but effective, powered by human muscle alone. The axe was for felling trees and rough shaping. The adze was used for flattening logs into beams. The saws, both two-man pit saws for ripping logs into planks and smaller hand saws for finer work, were crucial. For drills, called augers, were used to bore holes for joints, and the chisel and mallet were for cutting the complex joinery that held timber frames together. Medieval timber framing, in particular, was a work of genius. They used no nails or metal fasteners. Instead, buildings were held together by a precise system of interlocking joints, like the mortise and tenon, held fast with wooden pegs. This made the structures incredibly strong and flexible. Many of these timber-framed buildings are still standing and in use today, a testament to the skill of their builders that has lasted for over 500 years. The core survival skill is basic woodworking. It starts with understanding how to safely and effectively use an axe, a knife, and a saw. An axe can be used to fell a small tree for firewood or shelter poles. A knife can be used for carving simple tools, making pegs, or creating the notches for a simple joint. The ability to create a simple, effective joint like a square notch allows you to build a sturdy structure, whether it's a raised bed to sleep on, a table, or the frame for a shelter. It's about seeing a tree not just as a plant, in the abstract, but as a source of raw material. You learn to look at the grain of the wood, to understand how it will split and where its strengths lie. This skill is about creation. In a survival situation, the ability to build things is a massive psychological boost. It's the power to impose order on your environment, to improve your living conditions from a primitive state to one of relative comfort and security. You can build a better shelter, a more efficient trap, a more comfortable bed. You can craft a spoon to eat with or a paddle for a makeshift raft. This is the skill that separates us from the animals. We don't just find shelter, we build it. Mastering even the most basic woodworking techniques gives you a powerful set of creative options in any situation. It is the foundation upon which almost everything else in the medieval world was built. The master carpenters who built the great cathedrals and tithe barns of the Middle Ages did so without written blueprints as we know them. They used complex geometry and systems of proportion often laid out on a physical tracing floor. How much of this geometric knowledge was intuitive and practical rather than theoretical? What were the unwritten rules and tricks of the trade they used to construct such massive, complex structures with such precision? And could we, today, reconstruct a building of that scale and complexity using only their tools and their methods, or is there a gap in our understanding that we can't bridge? Number 9. What is the duct tape of the ancient world? Rope. If you had to pick one of the most underrated but absolutely critical technologies of the ancient and medieval world, it would be cordage. Rope and string were the invisible threads that held civilization together. They were used to haul stones for castles, to rig the sails of ships that enabled trade and exploration, to make the fishing nets that fed entire towns, to string the bows that won battles, and to bind the sheaves of wheat at harvest time. Without cordage, most of what we think of as medieval technology would be impossible. Making rope was a constant activity. From the simple twine a child might twist from grass to the massive anchor cables for a warship, which could be as thick as a man's arm and required a specialized building called a rope yacht to construct. The materials for cordage were all around. The best ropes were made from plant fibers like hemp, which was cultivated specifically for its strong, durable fibers, or linen from the flax plant. But for everyday, immediate needs, cordage could be made from a huge variety of materials. The inner bark of trees like linden or cedar could be processed into strong fibers. Plants. We often consider weeds like stinging nettles or milkweed produce excellent fibers for making string. Even animal products like sinew, the tendons from along the spine of a deer or other large animal, could be processed into an incredibly strong glue like cordage, perfect for attaching arrowheads or making fishing line. The technique itself is simple. In principle, you take a bundle of fibers and twist them. Then you take a second bundle and twist it in the same direction. Then you twist the two bundles together in the opposite direction. This reverse twisting is what locks the fibers together and gives the rope its strength. 2 strands can be twisted into a cord, and 3 cords can be twisted into a rope, and so on, to create cordage of any thickness and length. This is one of the most fundamental and empowering survival skills you can learn. Knowing how to make cordage from natural materials means you will always have what you need to tie, bind, lash, and build. You can walk into a forest with just a knife and come out with the materials to construct a shelter, set a snare trap, make a fishing line, build a fire with a bow drill, or create a strap to carry firewood. It is a true force multiplier. A simple stick is just a stick, but a stick and a piece of cordage can be turned into a tool, a weapon, or part of a structure. It's a skill that requires you to look at the plant world in a new way, to see the potential for strength hidden within the stems and bark of the plants around you. Learning to make cordage is a gateway to self-sufficiency. It's a small, meditative process that you can do while sitting by a fire, but the results are profoundly useful. It's one of the first things any survival expert will teach, because so many other skills depend on it. Otzi the Iceman had cordage made from grass and tree bast. The ability to create it is a core component of our human technological inheritance, stretching back tens of thousands of years. To learn it is to reclaim a piece of that ancient, powerful knowledge. We know the common materials like hemp and nettle, but like what were the second tier, cordage plants, right? What did a person in a specific bioregion, like a salt marsh or an alpine meadow, use to make their rope? Did they have techniques for treating cordage with waxes or tars to make it waterproof? And what were the specific recipes? And is it possible that the strength of some ancient ropes, like those used by the Egyptians to build the pyramids, came from a fiber processing technique or a type of plant that is now extinct or forgotten? Number 8. How do you find your way home when there are no roads? The medieval world was, for most people, very small. The average peasant might never travel more than 10 miles from their home village in their entire life. But for merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and sailors, travel was a necessity, and it was fraught with peril. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, and forests were dark, dangerous, and easy to get lost in. Maps were rare, expensive, and often wildly inaccurate. To navigate, people had to rely on a different set of skills. They had to learn to read the landscape, the sun, and the stars. This wasn't abstract knowledge, it was a constant, active process of observation and orientation. Getting it wrong could mean wandering for days, falling victim to bandits, or starving. The sun was the most reliable guide. It rises in the east and sets in the west, everywhere on Earth. By knowing the time of day, you could get a rough sense of direction. You could make a simple sun compass by placing a stick upright in the ground. The shadow it casts will be shortest at noon, when the sun is at its highest point in Thesky. That shortest shadow will point north in the northern hemisphere. The stars were the map for the night. The most important star was Polaris, the North Star. It is the only star in the night sky that does not appear to move, as it sits directly above the Earth's North Pole. By finding the Big Dipper, you can use the two stars at the end of its cup to point directly to Polaris. Once you find north, you know all the other cardinal directions. Sailors, especially the Vikings, were master navigators. They used the sun and stars, but recent archaeological evidence suggests they may have also used sunstones, crystals of calcite, that can detect the polarization of sunlight, allowing them to locate the sun's position even on a cloudy day. The skill is to learn to orient yourself without technology. It begins with paying attention. Before you go anywhere, even on a short walk in the woods, take a moment to notice where the sun is. As you walk, periodically look back to see what the trail looks like from the other direction. This helps you build a mental map. Learn to identify landmarks: a uniquely shaped tree, a large rock, a bend in a stream. Understand that water flows downhill, and small streams will eventually lead to larger rivers, which are often where settlements are located. Notice the prevailing wind direction, which you can see in the way trees are bent. In many regions, moss tends to grow more thickly on the shadier, damper side of a tree, which is often the north side in the northern hemisphere, though this is not a perfectly reliable rule. In a world where we blindly follow the instructions of a GPS, we have outsourced our own sense of direction. This makes us incredibly vulnerable. If the technology fails, we are literally lost. Relearning these ancient navigation skills is not just for a wilderness survival scenario. It's about re-engaging our own innate cognitive abilities. It builds confidence and sharpens our observational powers. It makes the world around us a readable, understandable place rather than a confusing green blur outside a car window. It is the freedom to move through the world with confidence, knowing that you carry the map and the compass inside your own head. The navigational feats of ancient peoples, like the Polynesians who settled the vast Pacific Ocean, still boggle the mind. They navigated thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, using stars, ocean swells, and the flight patterns of birds. How much of this incredibly sophisticated knowledge passed down orally has been lost? The Viking sunstone is a tantalizing theory, but did they have other, even more subtle navigational tools or techniques that left no archaeological trace? And are our brains so accustomed to passive navigation with GPS, losing the very neural pathways that allowed our ancestors to build and retain complex mental maps of their environment? Well, number 7, can a weed in your garden also be your medicine? Before modern pharmaceuticals, the forest and the field were the pharmacy. For the medieval person, knowledge of medicinal plants was not a hobby, it was a critical part of healthcare. Every village would have had a wise woman or a local healer who knew the uses of the local herbs. Monasteries were also centers of medical knowledge, and their extensive physic gardens were living libraries of medicinal plants. This was a holistic medicine. They believed in a balance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance. Herbs were used to restore this balance. While the theory was wrong, many of the treatments were effective because the plants contained powerful pharmacologically active compounds. This knowledge was hard-won, the result of centuries of trial, error, and careful observation. One of the most important figures in medieval herbal medicine was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, writer, and visionary. Her book Physica is a comprehensive text detailing the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, animals, and minerals. She described, for example, the use of willow bark for treating fever and pain. We now know that willow bark contains salicin, a chemical closely related to acetylsalicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They used yarrow, known as Herba militaris, to stop bleeding from wounds. Modern studies have shown that yarrow has astringent and antiseptic properties. They used garlic as a powerful antiseptic, comfrey to help mend broken bones, and chamomile to calm the nerves and aid sleep. This was not quackery. It was a functional plant-based medicine that, for many common ailments, was the only option available. The essential skill is to learn to identify and use a few key medicinal plants that grow in your area. This requires absolute certainty in your identification, as some medicinal plants have deadly poisonous lookalikes. A great place to start is with common, safe, and effective plants. Plantain, a common weed in lawns and fields, is an excellent remedy for insect bites and stings. You can simply chew a leaf and apply it to the affected area to draw out the poison and soothe the pain. Yarrow is easily identifiable, and its leaves can be crushed and applied to a cut to help stop bleeding. Elderflowers can be made into a tea to help with colds and flu. Learning to make simple preparations like teas infusions or poultices is the next step. A poultice is simply a soft, moist mass of crushed herbs that is applied directly to the body to treat an ailment. This knowledge empowers you to take care of your own health in a basic way. In a situation where access to doctors and pharmacies is cut off, a simple infection from a cut can become a life-threatening event. Knowing which plants have antiseptic properties can make a huge difference. Being able to treat a fever, soothe a cough, or relieve pain using plants from your own backyard is an incredibly powerful form of self-reliance. It also fosters a deeper respect for the plant world, making you realize that the weeds you pull from your garden are actually a potent and valuable natural resource. The medieval doctrine of signatures held that a plant's appearance indicated its use. For example, a plant with a heart-shaped leaf was used for heart ailments. While this seems like pure superstition, some examples uncannily line up with the plant's actual chemical properties. How much of this was coincidence, and how much was a forgotten system of mnemonics for a complex oral tradition? How many effective plant-based remedies were lost when this system was dismissed as unscientific? And with the destruction of natural habitats, how many undiscovered medicinal plants, potentially holding cures for modern diseases, are we driving to extinction before we even have a chance to study them? Number 6. How did people survive winter without refrigerators? For the medieval person, the harvest was a frantic race against time. The food they grew and gathered during the short summer and autumn months had to last them through the long, lean winter and spring. A failed harvest or an inadequate store of food meant months of gnawing hunger or outright starvation. The single greatest challenge was preservation. Without refrigeration or modern canning, how did they keep food from spoiling? They relied on a set of ingenious techniques honed over centuries that used natural processes to inhibit the growth of the bacteria, yeasts, and molds that cause decay. These methods were so effective that some of them are still used today, both by industrial food producers and by artisans creating gourmet products. The entire rhythm of the medieval year was dictated by this cycle of production and preservation. There were several key methods. Drying was the simplest and most ancient. Fruits, vegetables, and herbs were laid out in the sun or in a warm, dry attic to remove their moisture content, which microorganisms need to survive. Grains were dried in barns before being stored. Fish and meat could also be dried, often in the wind and sun, as is still done with stockfish in Norway. Salting was another critical method. Salt is a powerful desiccant, drawing moisture out of food and killing microbes. Meat and fish were packed in barrels of salt, a process called salt curing, which could preserve them for months or even years. This made long-range sea voyages possible and turned commodities like cod into a major economic force. Salt was so valuable for this reason that it was sometimes referred to as white gold, and salt trade routes were of immense strategic importance. Smoking was often used in conjunction with salting or drying. Meat was hung in a smokehouse, and the chemical compounds in the wood smoke acted as antimicrobials and antioxidants, while also adding flavor. Other methods included pickling in vinegar or brine, fermenting as with sauerkraut or beer, and preserving in fat confeting or sugar for fruits. The practical skill is learning the basics of food preservation without electricity. You can start with drying. Many fruits and herbs can be easily dried at home. If you are a gardener, learning to dry or pickle your excess produce means you can enjoy it year-round. If you are a hunter or fisherman, learning to smoke or salt your catch is a transformative skill. It means that a successful hunt can provide food for weeks, not just a few days. You can build a simple backyard smoker from a few pieces of wood or even a large cardboard box. You can learn the correct salt-to-meat ratios for curing. These skills drastically increase your food security. They allow you to take advantage of times of abundance to prepare for times of scarcity. This knowledge changes your relationship with food. You start to see food not as a disposable commodity, but as a precious resource that requires careful management. It forces you to plan ahead, to think in terms of seasons rather than days. In a long-term crisis, this is not just a useful skill, it is the absolute key to survival. The stores in the supermarket will be empty in days. The person who knows how to preserve the food they can find, forage, or grow is the person who will make it through the winter. We know the general methods of preservation, but what were the specific recipes and techniques that varied from region to region? What local herbs or types of wood smoke were used to create unique flavors and preservative effects? They had no knowledge of microbiology, so how did they develop such effective methods for controlling it? How do they manage to get the salt concentrations just right, to preserve the food without making it inedible, all through trial and error? And how many fermented food traditions, with their unique and beneficial probiotic cultures, have been lost to the modern era of pasteurization and refrigeration? Number 5, how do you catch your dinner when you can't go to the store? For a medieval peasant, hunting large game like deer or boar was often illegal. Forests were typically the property of the king or the local lord, and poaching was a crime punished with brutal severity, including mutilation or death. The forest laws established in England by William the Conqueror in the 11th century were a clear statement that the bounty of the wild belonged to the ruling class. So how did a common person get meat? They relied on trapping and snaring small game. Rabbits, squirrels, birds, and other small animals were an essential source of protein, especially during lean times. This wasn't sport, it was a quiet, patient, and highly skilled method of supplementing the family's diet. A well-placed line of snares could provide a steady supply of meat with minimal effort and risk. The traps themselves were marvels of simple engineering, made from natural materials. The most common was the simple snare, a loop of cordage placed on a game trail that would tighten around the animal's neck or leg. More complex traps used stored energy. A sapling would be bent over and held down by a trigger mechanism, often a figure-4 deadfall. When an animal took the bait, it would trip the trigger, causing the sapling to spring up, either lifting the snared animal into the air or dropping a heavy log at deadfall to kill it. These traps were designed to be set and left, allowing the trapper to go about their other chores. The skill was not just in making the trap, but in knowing where to place it. This required a deep understanding of animal behavior, knowing their trails, their feeding areas, and their habits. A trapper had to learn to think like their prey, to see the landscape through their eyes. The core skill is observation and patience. Learning to make a simple snare is easy. Learning where to put it is the real art. It starts with looking for signs of animal activity. Look for game trails, which are like little highways for animals through the woods. Look for tracks, dropping scat, and areas where they have been feeding. Once you find a promising spot, the placement of the trap must be precise. The loop of the snare has to be the right size and at the right height for the animal you are trying to catch. You have to camouflage the trap carefully, and crucially, you have to minimize your own scent, as animals have a keen sense of smell. This is a skill of subtlety and cunning. In a survival situation, the ability to passively acquire protein is a massive advantage. Actively hunting with a spear or bow is difficult, time-consuming, and often unsuccessful. Trapping allows you to multiply your efforts. You can have a dozen traps working for you while you are busy doing other essential tasks like improving your shelter or gathering firewood. It is a highly efficient way to get food. It teaches you to be a better naturalist, to pay closer attention to the subtle signs of the world around you. It is a quiet, deadly, and ancient art that has been putting food on the table for millennia. The traps that have been documented are the ones that were either written about or that are simple enough to be reverse engineered. What about the truly ingenious, complex, or regionally specific trap designs that have been lost? Did trappers have secret techniques for creating lures or scents to attract animals that were passed down only orally? And how did they manage the fine line of trapping enough to survive without depleting the local animal population, suggesting an intuitive understanding of wildlife management. Number 4, can you eat the weeds in your lawn? Foraging or gathering wild edible plants was a fundamental part of the medieval diet. It was the original safety net. When the crops failed or the stored grain ran low, people turned to the commons, the forests, meadows, and marshes to find food. This wasn't just starvation food. Wild plants, nuts, berries, and mushrooms were a regular part of their meals, providing essential vitamins and minerals that their often monotonous diet of bread and porridge lacked. This required an encyclopedic knowledge of the local flora. A medieval peasant could walk through a forest and see not just a collection of green plants, but a larder. They knew which roots to dig in the spring, which greens to pick in the summer, and which nuts and berries to gather in the fall. This knowledge was highly specific and deeply local. The plants available in the hills of Scotland were different from those in the forests of Germany or the coasts of Italy. But some plants were universally used. Dandelion, which we curse as a weed, was a valued food. The leaves were eaten as a salad green, and the root was roasted and used as a coffee substitute. Nettles, despite their sting, were a highly nutritious cooked green, similar to spinach. Chickweed, purslane, and lamb's quarters were other common weeds that were harvested as potherbs. Berries like blackberries and raspberries were gathered in abundance. Nuts, especially acorns from the oak tree, were a vital source of calories and fat. Acorns had to be carefully processed, however, by leaching them in water to remove the bitter, toxic tannins before they could be ground into flour. Misidentification was the greatest danger. Knowing the difference between wild carrot and its deadly cousin, poison hemlock, was a matter of life and death. The fundamental skill is to learn, with 100% certainty, the identification of a few common edible plants in your area. Let's start with the ones that are easy to identify and have no poisonous lookalikes. Dandelion is a perfect example. Once you are completely confident in identifying one plant, move on to the next. A good field guide is essential. The universal edibility test is often cited in survival manuals, but it is a last resort, risky procedure. A much better strategy is to acquire the knowledge beforehand. Learn the key identifying features of a plant, its leaf shape, its flower structure, its growth habit, or learn which parts are edible and at what time of year. In a crisis, the ability to forage for food can supplement your diet or even sustain you when other food sources are unavailable. It is the skill of seeing the world as a place of abundance rather than scarcity. It trains your eye to notice detail and to recognize patterns. More than that, it reconnects you to the food chain in the most direct way possible. To eat a plant that you have correctly identified and gathered yourself is a profound experience. It is a taste of the wild and a taste of true self-sufficiency. It is the oldest human survival skill of all. Our knowledge of medieval foraging comes from scant written records and archaeological analysis of preserved stomach contents or garbage pits. How many edible plants were a regular part of their diet that we have simply forgotten about? What were their methods for processing semi-toxic plants like acorns to make them safe and palatable? Did they have an intuitive understanding of plant families and their properties that guided their foraging, a kind of folk taxonomy that has been lost? And how much did the nutritional profile of these wild plants differ from our modern cultivated vegetables? Number 3, how do you build a home in an afternoon? Shelter is one of the absolute pillars of survival. The rule of threes states that you can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. But in a harsh environment, you can die from exposure in as little as 3 hours. For a medieval person caught out at night, whether a traveler, a shepherd, or a soldier, the ability to create a quick, effective shelter from the materials at hand was a life-saving skill. They didn't have tents or sleeping bags. They had a cloak, maybe a small axe, and their knowledge of the landscape. Their goal was not to build a permanent house, but to create a microclimate that would protect them from wind, rain, and cold, allowing them to survive the night. The shelters of medieval peasants, their actual homes, were often made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven wooden strips covered in a sticky mixture of clay, soil, and straw. But for immediate emergency shelter, the principles were much simpler. The most basic and effective is the lean-to. You find a natural windbreak like a large rock or a fallen log, and you lean poles against it to create a frame. You then cover this frame with whatever materials are available, leafy branches, bark, or sod. The key is to make it small, just big enough for you to lie down in. A smaller space is easier for your body heat to warm up. The second classic survival shelter is the debris hut. This is a slightly more complex but much warmer structure. You build a simple A-frame of sticks, like a long, narrow tent. Then you pile debris leaves, pine needles, grass, moss all over it in a layer at least 2 feet thick. You then crawl inside and block the entrance, also with debris. The thick layer of debris traps air, creating an incredibly effective insulating layer, like a natural sleeping bag. A well-built debris hut can keep you warm even in freezing temperatures. The skill is not just knowing how to build these shelters, but knowing where to build them. Site selection is critical. You need to avoid low-lying areas that could flood or collect cold air. You want to be protected from the prevailing wind. You should check for dead branches overhead that could fall on you, a real danger known as widowmakers. You also need to be close to your building materials so you don't waste precious energy hauling them long distances. The entrance should face away from the wind, and if possible, it should face east to catch the warmth of the morning sun. A small fire built near the entrance, with a reflector wall of rocks or logs behind it, can bounce heat into the shelter, making it much more comfortable. This is the skill of creating safety and comfort from chaos. To be cold, wet, and exposed is a demoralizing and physically dangerous state. The act of building a shelter is a powerful psychological tool. It is a focused, purposeful task that replaces fear with action. When you are finished, you have not just a place to sleep, but a home, however temporary. You have used your knowledge and your hands to create a small pocket of security in a hostile environment. It is one of the most primal and satisfying of all survival skills. The shelters we learn in survival manuals are based on general principles, but what were the specific regional variations of shelter building? How did a person on the coast build a shelter differently from someone in the mountains? What natural materials unique to certain ecosystems were used for waterproofing or insulation? And did they have techniques for building semi-permanent camouflage shelters for use as hunting blinds or hideouts that we have no record of? How much of this vernacular, unwritten architecture has vanished? Number 2, where do you find a safe drink when the water can kill you? You can survive for weeks without food, but only a few days without water. It is the most essential nutrient for life. For the people of the Middle Ages, finding water was rarely the problem. Europe is a water-rich continent. The problem was finding clean water. They had no understanding of microbiology, no concept of bacteria or viruses. They only knew that drinking from the wrong source could lead to sickness and death. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, all waterborne diseases, were rampant and deadly. In a river that flowed through a town was an open sewer, contaminated with human and animal waste. In a city, a public well could become a focal point for a devastating outbreak. The famous 1854 cholera outbreak in London, investigated by Dr. John Snow, was traced to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, perfectly illustrating a danger that had existed for centuries. Medieval people developed strategies to find safer water through observation. They knew that clear, cold, running water from an upstream source, like a spring emerging from a hillside, was the safest. They knew that stagnant water from a swamp or a pond was dangerous. They could dig a hole dug a few feet away from a river or a lake. The water would seep through the sand and gravel, which acted as a natural filter, making it cleaner than the water taken directly from the source. They also had a very simple and effective method of purification: boiling. While they didn't know it killed microbes, they knew from experience that boiled water was less likely to make them sick. Another common strategy was to avoid drinking water altogether. Most people, including children, drank small beer or watered-down ale and wine. The fermentation process to create these beverages killed most pathogens, making them a much safer alternative to water from a questionable source. The primary skill is knowing how to find the safest possible water source and how to purify it. In a wilderness setting, look for water at the source. A spring coming directly out of the ground is your best bet. If you can only find a river, always take water from the fastest moving part and go as far upstream as you can, away from any human or animal contamination. Pay attention to the landscape water flows downhill, so look for it in valleys and low points. Green vegetation is a good sign that water is near the surface. If you can't find a clean source, you must purify what you find. Boiling is the most reliable method. Bringing water to a rolling boil for just 1 minute will kill virtually all harmful pathogens. If you can't make a fire, you can create a simple filter. A container with layers of sand, charcoal from a fire, and grass can remove sediment and some impurities, though it will not remove viruses. This should be a pre-filter before boiling if possible. This is the single most important survival skill. Dehydration will incapacitate you quickly, impairing your judgment and your physical ability to perform other tasks. But drinking contaminated water can be even worse, leading to severe illness that will leave you completely vulnerable. Knowing how to find and purify water is the non-negotiable foundation of all other survival efforts. Everything else depends on it. How did people judge the quality of water without scientific tools? Did they have sensory methods, smell, taste, clarity that were more refined than ours? We know they drank beer and wine, but in situations where that wasn't available, what were their other non-boiling purification methods? Did they know of specific plants that could be added to water to help purify it? A kind of herbal purification system that has been dismissed as folklore? And how did their gut biomes, exposed to a different range of bacteria from birth, differ from ours? And did it give them a greater natural resistance to some waterborne pathogens? Number one, can you create light and heat from a stone? Fire is the skill that separates humans from all other animals. It is warmth, light, a way to cook food to make it safe and digestible, a means to purify water, a tool to harden the tip of a wooden spear, a signal to rescuers, and a comfort against the fear of the dark. For medieval people, fire was the center of the home. The hearth was a sacred place. Keeping the fire going was a constant chore, and letting it go out was a minor disaster. Most households would try to keep embers from the fire alive overnight, carefully burying them in ash. But if the fire did go out, or if you were a traveler needing to make a fire on the road, you had to know how to create it from scratch. There were no matches, no lighters, you had to make fire with skill and effort. The most common method throughout the Middle Ages was flint and steel. This was a revolutionary technology compared to the more primitive friction fire methods. A piece of high-carbon steel, called a fire steel, was struck against the sharp edge of a hard, flinty rock like flint or chert. This strike would shave off a microscopic particle of steel. The friction and force of the strike would heat this tiny particle to its ignition temperature, and it would fly off as a hot spark. The goal was to catch this spark in a suitable tinder. The best tinder was charcloth, a piece of linen or cotton cloth that had been cooked in an airtight tin until it was blackened and carbonized. This material will catch a spark and glow, but it won't burst into flame. The glowing ember from the charcloth was then transferred to a tinder bundle, a bird's nest-like ball of fine, dry, fluffy material like shredded bark, dry grass, or cattail fluff. By gently blowing on the ember inside the tinder bundle, you could coax it into a flame. The skill is not just in striking the spark, but in the preparation that comes before it. Fire making is a process of graduating sizes of fuel. You need your tinder fluffy, fine material, your kindling pencil lead to pencil-sized dry twigs, and your fuel wood larger sticks and logs. The most important part is gathering all of these materials and having them ready before you strike your first spark. A common mistake is to get a flame in your tinder bundle and then have nothing to feed it, so it quickly dies. The skill is in the patience and the methodical preparation. You must find dry materials, even in wet weather, by looking under fallen logs, in hollows, or by splitting open a piece of dead wood to get to the dry interior. Learning to make a fire without modern tools is perhaps the most empowering of all survival skills. It is the ability to create comfort and security out of nothing but knowledge and a few simple tools. It connects you to an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The moment a spark catches and a tiny ember begins to glow, and you carefully nurture that glow into a flame, is a moment of pure magic. It is a direct, visceral reminder of our own ingenuity and our ability to not just survive in the world, but to shape it to our will, to push back the cold and the dark. In flint and steel was the common method, but what about the older ways? Friction fire, like the bow drill, was still known and used in some areas. What were the specific wood combinations that worked best for a bow drill in different parts of Europe? We know they used charcloth, but what other natural materials, like specific types of fungus, tinder fungus, or Fomes fomentarius, did they prepare and use for catching a spark? And what were the secrets to banking a fire, to keeping embers alive for not just hours, but days at a time? a critical skill for conserving fuel and effort that we can now only guess at.